e-learning webinars, thought leaders. One of the things I'd like to point out is that we look to bring the online community as far as online learning, the sort of crossover experience from corporate L&D to other community groups such as national associations, medical societies, etc. So we're all about online learning, and I want to thank our joint sponsorship from our partnership from .org community. Before I introduce our upcoming schedule, but I do want to say a little bit about org community. Our partnership with .org community enables us to provide a larger audience with access to the brightest authorities in e-learning, like today's presenter. If you are not yet acquainted with .org community, it is a relatively new organization. It started in December of 2015, and what it does is it connects association executives and industry partners through online discussion forums, programs, webinars, and more. And it focuses on the right trends and solutions to position associations for future success. We encourage you to subscribe to .org community for even more online and live educational programmings. It's kind of a one-stop shop for those of you getting your certified association executive requirements out of the way. Learn more at www.orgcommunity.org. Okay, so we got a webinar series coming up, fall series. It's kicking off with David today. I'm going to introduce him in a second. You'll see there is some tie-in here. We've got how to curate today, and then next month we're going to talk about how next generation learning management system apps, authoring, and curation are using artificial intelligence, for example, to do some of this curation for you, or personalized learning apps. So Becky Wills of EdCast will be with us, and that's kind of an exciting new technology to share. We're also going to be sharing in November, Mike Rastisi's coming from Watershed, and the beauty of this lineup is that in order to do personalized learning, in order to do really good curation, we need good data connectivity behind the scenes. And as many of you know, the XAPI format allows us to take and tie together a lot of informal learning events and to track those without being inside a learning management system. So great lineup. So without taking any more time up, I do want to introduce David Kelly. David is the executive director for the e-learning guild, and it's very, very exciting, David, to have someone from the e-learning guild join us. Thank you so much for that. For those of you who don't know about the guild, it is an organization, community of practice of those of us that are in the space of online learning. They produce some excellent conferences, and I highly recommend it, as I've been a member for many, many years. So prior to joining the e-learning guild, David Kelly spent more than 15 years in senior management, learning, and performance roles. So he's been a senior vice president, for example, at New York Community Bank Corp, and vice president at other banks and groups. So he is now a leading voice exploring how technologies can be used to enhance training, education, and learning, and organizational performance. Mr. Kelly is an active member of the learning community and frequently contributes to the industry by writing and speaking at industry events. And of course, he is known for his expertise in curation. He's done a lot of curation as it relates to conferences and events. And I know our audience, especially our association and our community of practice audience here listening, very interested in curation, to this a business they've been in for a long time. So thank you very much, David, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here and to spend some time with you talking about curation here today. Just making sure you guys are seeing my screen before I jump in here. Good.
Yep, looks all good, David.
Excellent. All right, so we're here to talk about curation and how to curate. Over the next hour that we're together, there'll be a lot of information that I'll be sharing, a lot of questions that you might have. You might want to dig in deeper into this topic than we could possibly go into within an hour. So with that in mind, I want to point out a URL to get us started here. We'll put this URL out there, and I'll show it again at the end. But if you're interested in any of the slides that we're talking about, any of the resources that I mentioned, as well as just a number of additional resources, what this URL will take you to is a page on my blog that has all the resources I mentioned, as well as a number of additional resources that I've curated around the topic of curation, so that you can continue to revisit and dig deeper into this topic after the time that we spend together here today. So that URL will have everything that we discussed here today, and I'll show it again at the end here. So to get started, I think we have to just set a little bit of a baseline around what we mean when we say curation. Curation is one of the hottest buzzwords that's in our industry right now, and I say that with the pretense of I personally hate the idea of a buzzword. The reason that I say I hate the idea of a buzzword is what a buzzword actually is. I define a buzzword as a term whose usage is spreading faster than its understanding, and I would put curation under that category. There's a lot of discussions around what is curation and what isn't curation, and how it works and how it may not work. And it's an evolving conversation. But I think most people, when they think of the idea of what a curator is, what resonates with them, one of the first thoughts that commonly comes to people's mind is this idea of the museum curator. That's the space where we normally associate the idea of a curator, is in the museum. And the curator in the museum is the person who's responsible for creating that experience for you. You know, you go into a museum and we tend to overlook the experience that's been built by the curators. You go into I live just outside of New York City. I love going to museums in the city all the time. And we tend to forget that when we go into the building, we're seeing a sample of an enormous amount of artifacts that the museum might have available to them. I might see thousands of artifacts as I walk around the museum, but those are thousands out of potentially tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of artifacts that the museum has available to them. And it's the curator who decides which of those artifacts to put on display, and also what order to put those out on display for. If you think about an average museum that you've gone into, think about when you walk into a room and the particular path that might necessarily have been built as you go around. That's a story that's been shaped by a curator. Not only is it the artifacts that are on there, but the particular way that they're displayed, the order in which they're displayed. They are creating a narrative through the experience of curating. And we've seen that as long as museums have been in existence, but the idea of what curation has drastically changed and expanded. The curation conversation has expanded tremendously as we've gone into this new digital environment over the last couple of decades. Now, as we continue this conversation today, there's a couple of things I think we need to have a little bit of disclosure. And anytime you'll see this image of someone standing on a soapbox, this is an opportunity where I might say something that is my own personal reflection on things, as compared to something that might be a best practice, for lack of a better term, as it relates to curation. And this is the first time I want to do something like that. I think it's important to preface this discussion by realizing that curation is a topic that is rapidly evolving. The idea that anyone's going to come out there and say, this is what curation is, and this is what curation is not, and try to put a definitive line in the sand, chances are that that's not true, because it is an evolving conversation, and especially in the practice of learning and development, the opportunities that exist are still being defined and still being worked out. So this is something that we need to keep in mind as we're looking at curation. I believe that there's a tremendous amount of potential in curation, especially in the context of L&D, but a lot of that is still being worked out in terms of what it is and how it can be worked out. What I'll be talking about today at various times are a lot of the common ideas and common approaches that seem to be consistent across all of the curation discussions that I've seen. But when I do want to deviate from that and kind of put my own personal spin on it, I will point that out so you're aware of where the differences lie. But I mentioned the fact that we have this curation discussion has drastically increased it based on digital technology. And where curation is in a digital space is a little bit different than in a more traditional space like a museum. And a lot of people who are looking at the digital curation discussion will bring it into three major components. The first portion of it being something like user ratings, where you go into something like Amazon, and based on how people have rated different things, it rates things higher or lower. So you can see the things that people have rated higher over mass quantities of people voting, a crowdsourcing technique, which is digital technologies have made readily accessible. In addition, we have analytics that are running behind the scenes that can look at how people are consuming information and present them with related information that they might already be interested in. You think about your average Facebook feed, for those of you that are using Facebook, and it's amazing how, based on what you're consuming on Facebook, how they can push contextual things to you that match what you're already interested in. And there's a lot of analytics behind the scenes that are doing that. Now, those are the first two that I bring up there are what's in many cases driving a lot of the digital curation narratives, because there is this idea that there are tools that can curate for you. And I would argue, at least as we are where we are today, there's still that one other piece that is missing, and that is the curator themselves. You still need that human element who is making decisions that are related to why things are being curated, how they're being curated. That is incredibly important. And I think it's important to realize that, at least from my perspective, there are a lot of tools that are out there that identify themselves as curation tools. If you go out to Google and you say, show me some of the curation tools that are out there, you'll see somewhere around 16,000 different tools that can say that they can curate for you. I personally do not believe in 2017 that a machine can curate for you. They can collate information, they can aggregate information, they can organize information, but there's a human element. Even if we had the most complex system that curated things well for us, we still need that human being to make the decisions around how that algorithm works. So there are a number of, as in 2017, you still need a human being in order to be a curator. There are a lot of advancements in artificial intelligence and machine learning and deep learning that might change that, how I feel about that in the future. But as of where things are today, I still think that a human being is required for it to be really to be curation. So if humans are required to be a curator, who are the curators in a digital environment? And that's a question that I'm often asked. Who are the curators? Who in my organization should be a curator? Who's qualified to be a curator? And I think we need to step back from the L&D space to answer this question. When you think about who the curators are, you think about how life is being shaped by curation. I often say, if you want to see how a technology is changing how we learn, you don't look at education, you look at how we live. So if you want to see how technology is going to change how we learn, look at how technology is changing how we live. And curation is a good example of that. I remember years ago, when my mother was shortly after my mother got on Facebook, she contacted me and complained the complaint was essentially, why aren't you sharing pictures of my grandchildren on Facebook? And my response was a bit puzzled. I said, Mom, we live 5 minutes away. You see them all the time. Why are you concerned? And her response was interesting. She said, well, I share those with my friends on Facebook. I like to share pictures of my grandkids with my friends. She did not say, I want to be a curator. She did not want to say, curation never was part of her on the radar of what she was talking about. But essentially what she was saying, if you look at it from a different perspective, is I'm curating the story of my family on my Facebook, and you're not giving me the fodder with which to do it. That's a very important thing to realize, because in an age where we have share buttons, retweet buttons, pin it buttons, in a digital age, everybody can be a curator. It's a matter of how intentional you are about that process. And I think that's extremely important for us to realize, because now that's why this conversation has expanded so much, because there's so much noise that's out there. Curators aren't even something that is a nice to have, it's a must have. Steve Rosenbaum wrote the book Curation Nation. It's got one of my favorite quotes as it relates to curation, because I think it nails the value proposition in 2017. And what he said in the book was, curation replaces noise with clarity. And that really typifies where we're at in terms of digital information for me in 2018. There's a lot of noise that's out there, and curation is an opportunity for us to block out the noise so that we can concentrate on what's important. Now, I mentioned that there's no single definition for curation, but in order to really set a strong foundation, I think we need to look at some different types of curation. And what I'm going to talk about are 5 that are fairly commonly recognized within all the different curation conversations that I've seen online. And that is, they're by no means comprehensive. I'm not looking to imply that all 5 of these are. In fact, I would say, by my estimation, a couple of the 5 that I'm going to mention aren't, and I'll point out why. But I want to talk about the 5 that are most commonly referred to as different types of curation. So the first one is aggregation. This is essentially saying, show me all of the information that's out there. Bring me all of the data that's available to us. For instance, if I was going to go on Twitter and I was going to type in a hashtag around learning, basically what I'm saying to Twitter is, show me every single tweet that has the hashtag learning in it. I'm aggregating all of that content. Or even in a larger case, I could just say, I want to see all the tweets that are out there without even filtering it. That's aggregating. Show me that, give me all of the data, put it all in one place. That, and I forgive me, I think I neglected to say, I'm going to start from the most basic levels, and at each additional level that I introduce will become a little bit more complex. So aggregation is fairly widely referred to as kind of the lowest level of curation that you can be doing. Then from there, you would go into filtering. Now, this is where you have this large data set, an example that I was using before, all of the tweets that are out there, and then you start filtering it down. I could do searches on particular terms or hashtags or users that are there, where I'm taking this enormous set of data and putting filters in place to bring it down to a smaller subset of the larger amount of data that's there. And that could take an example of Twitter, could take the billions of tweets that are out there, and by me just putting in a couple of search terms, bringing billions down to hundreds of thousands, which is still an enormous subset, but is really starting to define what sort of information that I'm looking for. And that's kind of the next level up in terms of your data set. Now, aggregation and filtering are often referred to as baseline forms of curation. From my own perspective, I don't believe that aggregation or filtering qualify as curation. And the way that I'm defined, the logic behind my feeling that those are not curation is, aggregation and filtering are tasks that a computer can do for me. I can go into a data set and perform a query, whether that's on Twitter, whether that's on any other database. If I have the ability to do a query that pulls back only a subset of the information, that's just a task. That's something that I can do as part of curation, but those in and of itself are not curation. I don't believe that aggregation or filtering are curators. I believe that they are tools that a curator can use to be more efficient in what they're doing. If I wanted to go out and find the best tweets that were out there pertaining to a particular topic, I don't want to have to sift through billions of tweets individually. I want to bring it down to use technology to bring it down to the smallest subset that I can before I go in and do the manual process. So I see aggregation and filtering as kind of precursors before curation actually starts. But if you go out to other resources, you will see them referred to as kind of baseline forms of curation. So then when we go beyond filtering, we get into things that are a little bit more complex. First one is elevation. For me, this is kind of the baseline of L&D curation. This picture really resonates with me. I mentioned that I live outside of New York City. I live on Long Island. We go into the city all the time. And when we do, we often will drive. And as I'm driving over the bridge, I'm looking at the skyline that I love. And it's just it's a beautiful sight. But despite the fact that there are thousands of buildings in New York City, when I'm driving over that bridge, I really only see about 10 or 12 of them. Even though there are thousands of them there are only 10 or 12 that really get noticed. Why is that? Well, because they're taller. They are raised in a sea of endless buildings in Manhattan. Those 10 to 12 buildings that I notice I notice because they have been raised to a higher level of visibility within this sea of buildings that are there. And that's what elevation is as a form of curation. It's taking something from within a sea of information and elevating its visibility so that people can see it. And that is a very simple but effective use of curation that can be applied in any organizational context. We all work in organizations where a lot of times there is a small pocket of people who have built a better mousetrap. They figured a better way to accomplish a task within the organization. And L&D is uniquely positioned to be listening for those sorts of listening for those sources, to identify those pockets of information, and to take that small pocket of better practice, polish it, and elevate it to a better level of visibility so the entire organization can take advantage of it. That's just one simple example, but elevation is a form of curation that can be very quickly and easily leveraged by L&D. Then you get into things that are a little bit more complex. Mashups is a fairly complex version of it. If you're not familiar with what this imagery is referring to, if you took the movie The Wizard of Oz and you watching the movie, and at the moment that the film turns from black and white to color, you turned off the audio of the movie and started Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon album, and had that be the soundtrack to the film, the crescendos and decrescendos of the album match up what you're seeing in the film very well, but because the vibe of the music is very different, it's not just 1 and 1 equals 2, it's 1 and 1 equals A. It's apples and oranges. And a mashup is essentially when you take two completely unrelated things, put them together to form something entirely new. And curation, that's a very complex form of information, but one that can be extremely powerful. Putting it in the context of L&D, if I'm able to take to see a connection between two seemingly unrelated pieces of information and then point out that connection, but when presenting these two pieces of information together to a group of people and then helping them build the bridge between the two, that can be an extremely powerful form of learning. So mashups is another technical one. And another one that could very easily be leveraged by L&D is something as simple as a timeline. This is rather than telling the story of something and literally creating it backwards and forwards, it's going out and finding unique assets that can also be used to tell that story and simply putting those assets into a chronological order. So rather than writing up the entire story, you use existing assets that are out there that tell isolated pieces of the story, put them into chronological order, and then allow that to tell the timeline. Now, these are just 5 common examples. You see a link there where you can get more detail on the 5 models of content curation, and you'll see that link curated on my website link that I showed you earlier. But those are 5 of a number of different things that are there, different versions of curation. One type that I intentionally did not leave off that I do want to talk about, it's a phrase that you'll hear very often. It's this idea of personal curation. I don't believe personal curation exists. A lot of people will say, oh, these are resources that I've curated for myself so that I can learn from it. I don't believe that personal curation exists myself. I believe that when we're doing things for ourselves, we're filtering information, we're collecting information, we're doing it for our own personal needs. But curation has an external focus. You're curating for others. You're curating not based on your own individual needs and your own wants and needs. You're curating based on the needs of others. So one type of curation that you hear often, if you're looking into this, is this idea of personal curation. And my personal feeling is that it's mixing in something that is muddying what curation is. I think in order for it to truly be curation, it needs an outward focus. So what does curation look like in practice? Let's talk about the unique parts of curation. Curation can usually be broken down into 3 unique elements. There are a number of different labels that can be applied to each of these 3 components, but they're all essentially describing the same 3 parts. So regardless of what label you might want to associate with each of the 3, they're what they are as a definition is pretty consistent. But I think it's important to walk through each piece so you can see how curation only works when all three are in balance. So the first part of curation is the ability to listen. And that is essentially keeping your ear to the ground of wherever the conversations or sharing is taking place, wherever the data or information that you need to curate from is, you need to be a part of it. You need to be tapped into that so that you can be able to find those conversations. And listening takes a number of different forms. It could literally be water cooler conversations. It could be interactions on social media. It could be things that people are blogging about. It could be things that you actively go out to find and discover. But it's the idea of keeping your ear to the ground and keeping tapped in to whatever the conversation is that you're looking to curate from. You need to be consistently listening in order to be able to do that. The second part is about analyzing the information. It's not just enough to be able to look at listening to the information that's out there. You have to be able to look at it through a critical eye and really look at that analysis and do some analysis to determine, is what I'm listening to, is what I'm reading important? And there's a number of different aspects of that. It's a matter of, does it match our culture? Are there unique insights that were included in whatever the resource was that you want people to take away from it? Is it within does the resource that you're looking at match the context of why people would be coming to it? All of that information is stuff that you need to be looking at, and questions you need to ask yourself about the resources that you're looking at to decide, do I want to curate this? And after you're listening to the information, you're analyzing the resources that you're looking at. The next thing is to share it. But the sharing piece of it can be equally as important as the other two. It's not just a matter of, okay, I've got this, I think it's of value, I'm going to put it out there. How we share it is important. You could be sharing it in the form of questions to try to create learning opportunities. You could create new and unique articles or videos that are referencing curated content. There are also some important aspects of curation that I think are often overlooked. For instance, the attribution piece of it. Curation leverages existing content, but the idea of, to oversimplify it, giving credit where credit is due is incredibly important. How you share it there are copyright rules that would need to be followed to make sure that you're using them appropriately. And again, to oversimplify it, give people credit for the resources that you're leveraging. And also the importance of timely sharing is important as well. The right information shared at the wrong time is just as meaningless as the wrong information shared at the right time. So we want to make sure that we're doing all three of those pieces. And you have to do all three in balance, because if you're listening and you're analyzing but you're not sharing, all you're really doing at that point is building relevance. If you're listening and you're sharing but you're not taking the time to analyze it, all you're doing is adding to the noise. You're just producing more content. If you're analyzing and sharing but you're not really listening to things, you're just organizing it. You're not building relevance. You're not adding the volume. All you're doing is analyzing the existing information. It's only when you're building relevance and sharing that information, and you're listening, you're analyzing, and you're sharing in tandem, that you really have a quality curation model in place. So it's important to be looking at all three of those in order to do it. And again, listen, analyze, share are just the labels that are there. Harold Jarkey refers to this as seek, sense, share. There are other people who use different labels to describe all three, and they might have their unique spin that they put on each. But essentially, we're talking about these three primary activities, regardless of the label. You need to listen, you need to analyze, and share. And those three parts are consistent across most of the curation discussions that you would see. But from my standpoint, I would get on my soapbox and point out that from my perspective, there's actually a fourth part that is very often missing within the curation discussion that I think is incredibly important. We talk about those three things, but there is this element of curation, and it's tied to what I was talking about earlier, where there's no personal curation, there's only curation for other people. There's a piece of it that is missing that I think needs to be part of it, especially within the context of organizational L&D curation. And that word would be purpose. You need a purpose to when you're curating within an organization and you're curating for other people, you need to have a purpose. Your purpose determines the why of curation. To be curating for a specific reason, every time you do something for curation, when I talked about that analysis part of curation, the purpose is what's vetting it. Is this matching my purpose? Is what I'm going to do here in the context in which it's going to be applied going to match the reason, the purpose that I am curating in the first place? That's incredibly important. Purpose determines the questions that you ask when you're analyzing. It explores questions like, why am I curating? What's my goal? Who am I curating for? What problem am I solving? Curation for curation's sake is not helpful. It should be solving some level of a problem. And if you can answer questions like the 4 you see on your screen now, that helps get you closer to the purpose of your curation. Your purpose, the purpose of, when you answer those questions, it's that purpose that creates the parameters and the constraints that help you truly focus what you're doing when you're curating. So what does this look like in practice if you add 4 pieces together? It's a very simple model that looks a little bit like this. The first thing is to take the time to identify your purpose, to look at why you're curating and identify those parameters, because curation is not something you bestow. The label of being a curator is really not something that you bestow upon yourself. I could be hired by an organization tomorrow as the chief knowledge curator, and despite the fact that that's on my business card, I am not truly a curator until an organization or the audience that I am responsible for sees me as a curator. It's the audience that essentially bestows upon you the title of curator, because I could be a curator and I could be curating all sorts of things because it's my job description, but if nobody's listening to it, nobody has that trust in me to be curating resources that are of value, I don't care what it says on my business card. I'm not a curator if I'm not a curator in the eyes of the people that I'm curating for. So that, and taking the time to identify your purpose, to identify your why is critical, because then when you get into those 3 other pieces of it, the idea of listening to where the conversations that match your purpose are taking place, to do the analysis to determine, are there resources here that match my goals, that are in the context that resonate with my audience? If so, then I will share it and then I will continue listening. It's the purpose that enables the listening, analyzing, and sharing circle that is continuously going on to be effective. And you have to do all 3. Now, I want to give you an example of my story of where this idea of purpose came from. Because the listen, the analyze, and the share piece, in my opinion, that's the easy piece. It's the purpose piece that can sometimes be challenging. And I want to give you an example of what curation looks like in practice and how it can be applied in, I'll give you a couple of other examples of how it can be applied in L&D and in other contexts that we can learn from. But I want to share the story of how I got started in this idea of curation, because I think it helps identify that practice. I refer to myself often as an accidental curator. The idea of curation started when John mentioned earlier. I follow conferences all the time. Now it's my job to be in conferences, but I've been an active participant in conferences for well over a decade. I find them to be great opportunities for learning. And when I was working for organizations, I was fortunate that my organization would support me going to learn from a conference, would help buy the registration if need be, support my travel, but I could only go to 1, maybe 2, if I was extremely fortunate, conferences in a year. And I noticed that there were all these different conferences that I wanted to go to. But what I discovered is, even if I couldn't go there were people who were going to these conferences who were sharing what they were learning via Twitter. And back in 2010, I think DevLearn was one of the first conferences that I did this for. I would go and I would see all these resources, and they would be going by so fast that I didn't always have the time to consume them at all the stuff that was being shared. So what I would do is I would bookmark them, and I would collect what was shared there, so that after the conference ended, all these things that were shared, I could dig into and learn a great deal from them. And while I was doing this, it was also around the time I started blogging, and I just thought, you know what, rather than just having these things local in a Word doc, I'll just post them on my blog. I can reference them then there, and if they're useful to anyone else, maybe they can click the links too. Kind of just put it out there. And what I discovered was that people did find these resources to be really valuable. But you notice, I bring up this one specifically because you notice the title of this is just talking about learning resources that I've collected, because that's what I was doing at that point. And as I started doing this for a number of different events over the next couple of months and years that followed, shortly thereafter, people started to expect that I was doing this, and you know, a lot of people would tweet that this is a great resource, you should see what David's doing, blah, blah, blah. And suddenly people started referring to me as, you should see the resources that David Kelly is curating. He's a master curator for conferences. And it was a label that I didn't seek out. It was a label that I didn't know if I had actually earned. And when I looked at what this meant for people to be starting to call me a curator, I started looking into the curation a little bit, and I realized that a lot of this had this exterior value. So I started asking myself the question, well, what is it that people are, why do people find this valuable? Why do they come to this? Why have people started to kind of come to expect me to do this? And what value is it that it's generating? And I asked some people, and they found, I started understanding the value. And the moment that it kind of clicked for me from a curation standpoint was when I was looking to share a link that I was looking in a conference back channel, and I paused. And that pause was because I wasn't going to, it was something that I looked at and I said, this really isn't something that I'm interested in. And that moment gave me pause. Because while I was collecting in the past, if something, when I skimmed it, didn't resonate with me, it wasn't something I was interested in, I just moved on. But now I started looking at this and said, well, wait a minute, maybe it's not interesting to me, but maybe it's something that it could be of value to someone else, the other people who are coming to this site. And that's where I started shifting my focus. It suddenly became something where I wasn't collecting things that I was interested in. I was curating resources that I thought could have value for other people. And that completely changed the paradigm of how I approached this. It was still something that I was finding valuable for myself, but I started vetting things in a different way. I started looking and saying, could this be of value to anybody, even if it's not in the space that I'm in? If so, it's in. Is it something that if it's a link that somebody is putting out there just as a lead gen, where you can't get to the resource, but somebody without giving someone, you have to pay for it in some way, whether that would be with money or with information. I vetted that out. There started to be this criteria of how can I better curate to give the value of what people are coming, that I'm seeing people expecting it for. And that's where it shifted from resources that I was collecting to resources that I was sharing with people. And if you look at what that looks like in practice, what I was doing originally was essentially just listening to the back channel. The two orange sections is what I was doing originally. I was listening to what was going on in the hashtag, and I was sharing it. If I thought it was interesting, I shared it. It wasn't until I started identifying the purpose behind what I was doing, which was to search a conference back channel and share resources that could be valuable in expanding the learning from a conference. That was my guiding principle. And once I had that guiding principle in place, it enabled me to listen to the hashtag differently, to look for tweets that are expanding on the learning, to analyze it and say, is there something of value for others? Or does it go against some of the standards that I have in place? And if so, then I would share it on that list. So the criteria for how you got onto that list changed to better match the audience that was there. So I want to show a couple of additional examples of how this looks, what this could look like in practice. I spent some time working for a nonprofit that supports individuals with developmental disabilities. And one of the things we did during onboarding, which was very powerful, was we had one of the senior leaders come in and talk about our mission. The mission of the organization was a tagline called "For an Enviable Life." The idea that everyone, regardless of whether or not they have a developmental disabilities, has the human right to lead an enviable life. And people with developmental disabilities just have that hurdle to get over in order to do that. But they have the same rights that anyone else does. And that was the mission. And we had one of the senior leaders come in and give a very impassioned speech because we wanted that idea of for an enviable life to be part of our organizational DNA. And it was a very powerful speech. The problem was that it was a very powerful 20 to 60 minute speech that was part of a 2-day content dump of onboarding. and it lost some of the effectiveness. And we wanted this to really become part of our organizational DNA. So what we did was we used Scoop.it, which is a fairly common curation tool. And I told a number of senior leaders, anytime you see an article, I don't care where it came from, anywhere, whether it's online or from a newspaper, what have you, that is telling the story of an individual with developmental disabilities overcoming their disabilities to lead this idea of an enviable life, I want you to send me that link. And what we did was we created this Scoop.it page that you see here, where we collected those stories. And we posted the link to this periodical on our SharePoint site. And every week we would remind people, hey, there's 3 new links on the Scoop.it page this week. And by people reading these stories that represented this idea of what we meant by an enviable life, it started to connect with people. The more they were encountering these stories, the more contextual it became, the more it just became part of their thought process. And it was a good example of us using curation to start teaching people what we meant by this soft skill for an enviable life. Another example of ways that we do this, and I bring this one up specifically for the method in which I do it, because it brings up an element of curation that I think is often left out. Every week on Monday on the eLearning Guild blog, Twist, I curate a number of resources, things that I found that were interesting each week, and I post them to the blog. But what I do on there is I don't just share the link and say, here's 5 different links. One of the things that's incredibly important within curation is it's not just a matter of sharing the link, it's the value that you add. So when I share these every single week, I'm sharing the link, but I'm also sharing 2 to 5 sentences on why I think you would want to click that link. Of here's what this story is about, and here's why it's important for me for L&D. And if you check out the curation I'm doing there, a good number of times I'm not curating things from within the L&D space. I'm curating things from outside the L&D space that has lessons that learning and development professionals can learn from. So it's an interesting aspect of how curation can be used, and the importance of adding context and value to something when you're sharing it. It's one of the reasons I like Scoop.it as a tool. Because it by default, when you're sharing something on that, if I go back to that previous screen where you saw it, by default, it's asking you for a comment and asking you to provide some additional context around why you shared something. So it's an important piece of it. Other examples of curation that are, I think it's important for us to not only look within L&D, but to look outside of L&D to see curation in practice and to find elements of it that we can learn from. Sometimes you don't even realize that a lot of the websites that are out there are curation process. For instance, one of the most popular sites that's out there right now is BuzzFeed. And BuzzFeed curates content from all over the place. They look for things that people might be interested in, things that could be going viral, things that people can talk about and share amongst themselves. They do it incredibly well. But if you look at their website, I encourage you to go there and just look at it differently. Rather than looking at the content they're sharing, look at how they're sharing it. Go to if you're looking at the screen here, go to More and go to About BuzzFeed and look at how they consider themselves to be a website, what their goals are, and then go back after reading that, go back to the website and look at the content and see how the content they're sharing is tied to those goals. Another example of one, brain pickings. This is one from an L&D perspective. I think everyone should bookmark this site and see what they have. She shares tremendous stuff there. Maria Popova is one of the best examples of a curator in a digital age that I've seen. She does an exceptional job, because what she does that's different than a lot of other curators is the majority of time what you're sharing here is not what she's sharing here is different than I do. What I do is I give you 2 to 4 to 5 sentences in what I do every week around why you would want to click the link. She goes into much greater detail. She's curating from the discussion, and her posts in and of themselves have value that makes you want to dig deeper into the original post through which she shared it. It's an exceptional job of someone who is adding value in her own unique content by sharing things other people have done. Another example would be SmartBrief. SmartBrief basically goes around to all the news sites that are around the web, routers and other places as well. and shares the different links that are out there, but then they add their own unique context, a paragraph or so like you see here around their context. But if you want the full story, you dig into the story itself. And there are entire businesses that are built around the idea of curation as a content creation tool. I encourage you to look at BuzzFeed and Brain Pickings and SmartBrief as examples of how that can work, and how we can, the lessons of what they're doing that we can take and apply in the scope of L&D. Because regardless of which one you're looking at, the model that I mentioned earlier, they all have their purpose, and they're all listening, analyzing, and sharing in their own way. They all can take this model and apply it to practice. Regardless of which site you look at that's applying curation, this model can be applied to all of them. And that purpose thing, the reason why sites like SmartBrief, Brain Pickings, and BuzzFeed and others are successful is because they have those constraints around purpose that shape what they do. So L&D, why would we use this in L&D? It can do a number of different things for us. First off, it can enable us to create solutions and solve problems faster. The idea of us, the world that L&D has for decades existed in, the idea, when I was working in banking, it was not that uncommon for someone to come to my office with a need, a training need, or a problem that needed to be solved that we were looking at training as a solution. And for me to say something like, well, yeah, no problem, let me go out and do some needs analysis for that. It's going to take me about 2 weeks to do that. Then I'll come back to you. We'll have a discussion the following week to look at what our suggestions are. Based on that discussion, we'll take 2 weeks to put together a pilot program that over a 4-week span we'll put out to 10% of our workforce. After that, we'll take a couple of weeks to analyze it, make some tweaks, and then we'll roll it out to the rest of the workforce for the following 6 months. And it's like an 8-month project to birth this training program. That's not an option anymore. We are in an environment of now, and the opportunities for us to create, it's less common to see that in an organization today, and more common to have someone walk into your office at 4 o'clock on a Friday telling you what they need to be implemented on Monday. Curation is another tool in our belt that enables us to deliver solutions faster. It starts from a standpoint, curation starts from a place of, has someone solved this problem already? And rather than taking extremely large amounts of time to create a solution that already exists, spending substantially less time finding the solution and presenting it to your workforce. Take something like leadership development as an example. Most organizations have a leadership development program. Most organizations also create that, either buy it completely off the shelf or create something unique in-house. And if you look at all the different organizations that have created leadership development programs uniquely in-house, I would argue that anywhere between 60 and 80% of that content is the same, regardless of what organization that you look at. And if you accept something like that and say, well, you know what, if 60% of the content on whatever program that we're creating is going to be fairly generic, maybe we can find that elsewhere. We can curate that and therefore spend our resources on the 20 to 40% of the stuff that's truly unique to our organization. So it enables us to be more selective on and more strategic about where we're going to place our content creation efforts. But there's another reason that I think L&D is uniquely positioned to take advantage of curation as a tool, and why I think it's so incredibly important in the work that we do. And that's the role that curation has in personal growth. We are uniquely responsible for creating professional development opportunities in organizations. There are others who support it as well, but if we are trying to create an environment, a culture of learning in organizations, to give people the opportunities to grow, curation is an enormous part of that. And it's not only an enormous part of it within the context of organizational L&D, but it's, again, part of the context of life. If you think about the digital world that we live in, and this is borrowed from a TED talk from Eli Pariser called "The Filter Bubble." That the link is on that resource page that I set up. It's under 15 minutes, I believe. The talk. It's if you haven't seen it, I suggest you watch it. But what this is talking about is this idea of a filter bubble. And if you look at this graphic that's in front of you, consider all of these. In the center is you, and around you is this limitless world of digital content that's available through the internet. But if you think about that, all that limitless content, how do we access it? We access it through portals, some of which you see around the circle here, like Amazon, Netflix, Yahoo News, Huffington Post, and all these different things. And we access them through these portals. All of these portals have certain things in common. One of them, the biggest thing that they have in common is they are all in the business of personalizing your experience. Take Amazon for an example. I go to Amazon and I make a purchase. I always have the same, I almost always have the exact same thought after I complete checkout on Amazon. I get to that confirmation screen and I think, ooh, I want that too. Because they give you this line of other things you might be interested in that are spot on to who you are as an individual. It's the algorithms that Amazon is running really can personalize the experience for you. Think about Google or whatever search engine you like to use. They are in the personalization business as well. If everyone who's participating in this webinar right now went to Google and typed in the exact same 4-word phrase to search on it, curation in learning and development or something like that, we would get different results. On the first page, we might get some of the same ads, or we might get some of the first couple of, some hits might be the same, but it's not like we would get the same results. Why? Because Google is bringing in huge amounts of context to that search that you just did to make it as personalized to you. It's bringing in geolocation data. It's bringing in your search history. It's bringing in your purchasing history on other sites. It's bringing in your Gmail account data if it's there. It's all personalized so that you are finding what it is that you're looking for, which on the surface does not sound like a bad thing. The idea that the technology is being shaped in a way so that I can get what I'm looking for doesn't sound like a bad thing, but put it in a different context around this idea of personal growth. If every portal that I'm looking at, if every portal that I'm using to access the limitless world of the internet is in the business of personalizing the experience so that what I get is what I'm already interested in, that can be very dangerous. For instance, some of the examples you see here are news sites, Huffington Post and Washington Post. If Washington Post and Huffington Post are using that sort of analytics to push information in that already agrees with my political point of view, or it already agrees with some of the biases that it through data has identified me as carrying, I don't get the other side of the story. And that applies to every single platform that's out there. If every platform is going through the limitless world of data and only giving me the stuff that it thinks I'm interested in, I don't get the limitless world of the internet. What I get is an experience that already agrees with who I am. And this wall that's formed around me through these portals prevents me from really experiencing that limitless world. And that's why it's so passionate for me for personal growth, because the areas of personal growth as an individual or within the organizational context of learning, the ability for me to grow isn't within that circle. The space that is going to enable me to grow is what's outside that circle. Because if I'm not having the opportunity to go outside that circle, my internet looks like this. Things that already agree with me. And L&D is uniquely positioned to take advantage of this. If we can see that this green circle, metaphorically, that's just outside of the field of view of an individual has resonance, it has some context, and I can point out that context as to why it's important, bring it into that person's field of view and say, here's something that may not be on your radar that I think you should read, and here's why it's important, and here's how it ties to your life. That's a unique opportunity for personal growth. It's what's enabling our comfort zones to expand. And that's what's going to help us we are uniquely positioned within learning and development to be that curator, to find the things that are of value that people can't see, to help them see it, and to build that context as to why it's important. The more we're able to do that, the more we will be able to help the people that we support grow as individuals, and therefore help our organizations grow accordingly. And with that, I want to just come to a couple of summary points as our time goes down. First off, the thing that I would say is curation isn't just about collecting and filtering. It's not about aggregation. It's not about just filtering information. It's about adding value to what you're sharing through context and doing analysis. It's also about a purpose. If you can't identify the purpose of what you're doing, if you can't identify a why associated with curating, don't. Pause, go back and find out, do I have a purpose here? If you can't nail down what that purpose is, then curation probably is not going to be effective. And curation isn't just about delivering learning opportunities, it's about providing people an opportunity to grow. It's not about creating a course through curation. You can, and you can do that and it's effective, but it's really about providing people with an opportunity for growth. And with that, I want to remind you of that URL that I mentioned earlier. If you go to that, it will go to a page on my website that has these slides. It has all of the resources that I talked about during this talk, as well as a host of other ones if you want to dig deeper into this conversation. And with that, I believe we have a couple of minutes left. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them into the chat and I'd be happy to answer them. And again, I'm obviously passionate about this conversation. You see my contact information on the screen there. You can always feel free to reach out to me directly as well. But with that, I will formally close and answer any questions that might come through chat.
Hi, David. I actually had a couple of questions from John. So within an association, should the curation role be centralized?
Should it be centralized? It's a good question. I mean, I'll give the cop-out answer of it depends first. But the reason that I say that is it's good to have centralized, because it's good to have it centralized, even if it's centralized within a small group of people, because that enables the understanding and the implementation around purpose to stay consistent. The idea of having a single person owning that is good, but it's in many organizations it's probably unlikely. The idea of I think while I am seeing some organizations adding a headcount that is dedicated to curation, most of the opportunities for curation to be leveraged in an organization are coming around where it's a responsibility that is added to someone's existing role or existing roles, which, because it's not a dedicated person, a lot of times it's centralized within a job function or within a group of people to handle it that way.
Thank you. It looks like we do have another question that came through, or a comment. So we have an education subcommittee with members and to curate the content. They are the subject matter experts. So
having a subcommittee that is responsible for the content can be useful. There's where I would draw caution, and I would come back to the example I used from the nonprofit that I worked for. One of the reasons that worked was because that subcommittee that I identified, a number of senior managers, their only responsibility in their busy lives, and I throw that quotation mark out there because we're all busy, was the only responsibility that they had was, if you find something interesting, send me a link. That they were the subcommittee. That was what enabled me to funnel that content to me, but I was still the one driving the curation. I was still the one that was driving the mechanics of pulling those things together, putting them on Scoop It, republishing the page, which wasn't a very, very laborious task, but you still needed that person who was driving that wheel to keep moving, the listening, analyzing, and sharing, where the subcommittee was just kind of the funnel of the content. I see another question coming in the chat around the skill sets that people should look for in hiring a curator. What types are best suited as a curator? Yeah, you need, there's a certain layer of data analysis skills. The ability to mine information is incredibly important. The ability to use systems that can filter information is incredibly important. I know I said a couple of times that I don't see aggregation and filtering as a form of curation, but they are indispensable tools of the curator. If I am not skilled at being able to filter and aggregate content effectively from the database that I'm going to be curating from, I'm not going to be effective, because I'm going to spend way too much time trying to sift through large amounts of data rather than using technology to bring it down to a smaller subset, so that I can do that. And while it's difficult to quantify this as a skill set, if I was going to be hiring a curator, and I've actually done this for the organization I work for, the Guild, is I hire people who help me build conferences. They are essentially curating from our field of stories that they want to tell. And one of the things that is incredibly important to me as I'm talking to people who might join our programming team is what is their level of curiosity about this topic? Because yes, you need the skills around being able to find information, being able to pull out the context, and being able to summarize in a concise manner information and build the connections. Those are all tactical skills. But if you don't have the curiosity attached to it, then you don't necessarily have the drive needed to really be a passionate curator.
So it looks like we just have one last question, and we'll just wrap up the webinar because we are at the half hour. So what's the difference between knowledge management and curation? And is setting up a taxonomy part of curation?
It's a good question. There are a number of people that are out there that tie curation to knowledge management. And if you're interested in exploring that, Mark Rosenberg has actually done some stuff in content curation in the curation space, where he sees a much stronger link between knowledge management and curation than I generally do in the way that I position it. I position knowledge management as the ability of making information found when and where it's needed. It's an organization of content so that it can be mined easier. I see, for me, if there is a strong knowledge management approach within an organization, it's going to enable me to curate better, because I'm not going to waste as much time finding stuff. But knowledge management, if you look at a Venn diagram between knowledge management and curation, depending on how you're in, I would say that they're two separate circles that don't necessarily need to overlap. They can connect to one another in many ways, but depending on how you're defining them and how your strategy aligns the two of them, those two circles can tend to overlap a little bit, but I do consider them to be related terms, not synonyms. I hope that was helpful as an answer.
All right, well, thank you so much, David, for your webinar today. It was very insightful. So thank you, everyone else, for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the webinar. There is a short survey that will pop up after the webinar closes. If you do have time to take that, we always appreciate your feedback. Otherwise, we will be sending a follow-up email with the link to the webinar recording so you can watch it again. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.